We'll do a review on the Sichas in Chelek Ches, volume 28. This is the Sicha for Gimel Tamuz. We're learning this Lilu Nishmas. Rav Levi Yitzchok ben Rav Chaim Tzvi, a dedicated shliach, successful shliach of the Rebbe, and unfortunately he was taken in an early uh, days of his life. He had a lot to accomplish, but Hashem decided that it was his time, and we're learning this to benefit his soul. Tehin Nishmasei Tzurura B'Tzurura Chaim. So Gimel Tammuz. This Sikha, the Rebbe explains something very astounding, that the previous Rebbe was told on Thursday that he can leave after being imprisoned and first condemned to death, Rahman al-Islam, and later on for 10 years exile. He was finally the punishment for his services for the Klal Yisrael, for his work for Yiddishkeit. He was finally punished for 3 years to go into exile into Castrama. And when they told him on Thursday that he is free to go and he has 6 hours to be home and then has to leave by the evening, he inquired, when does the train arrive in Castrama? And they said on Shabbos. He says he won't go because he will know under no circumstances will he travel on Shabbos. But the Rebbe this is very perplexing. I mean, this whole the situation, the danger that he was in, and the opportunity to get out. Later on, they couldn't figure it out the Shabbos and everything. They first thing you get out. How come the Friedrich Rebbe refused to go out? And this is very perplexing. The Rebbe explains that this wasn't just about Shabbos. This was about the attitude. This was because they wanted to force the Rebbe to drive on Shabbos, and they would announce it, even if the Rebbe didn't end up going on Shabbos. But that would be the impression. And in such a case, you're not allowed to. You have to go Mesiras Nefesh. But the Rebbe says it's deeper than that. The Rebbe says that the previous Rebbe decided when he went in, he writes that he's not gonna consider any of them, to not gonna listen to their orders and to their dominance. He's gonna hold them totally of non-existence. They would not impact him at all. But why would the Rebbe do that? That's not even in the service of Hashem. The Rebbe ties this to the parsha of Chukas, which is always near Gimel Tammuz, that this was something ingrained that was part of him. So it wasn't a question. You couldn't separate them. We'll go step by step. And this is Gimel Tammuz, Aleph. Gimel Tammuz, the third of Tammuz, der Tog ven Kveit Kedushas Merichom Admur. That is the day that my father-in-law, the Rebbe, is befreit geworden from Beis Hasurim, that he was freed from prison. So the Rebbe says that that's connected to the Parshas Chukas. Falt ois bekam shonim. So in many years it comes out bismiches to Shabbos Parshas Chukas. It comes out close to the Shabbos in which we read the portion of Chukas. Amol in der Woch from Parshas Chukas. Sometimes it's actually in the week that we read the portion of Chukas. Ulifamim, and a time in the tag welche werden misborech for Shabbos Parshas Chukas. Those days which are blessed from the portion of Chukas, which means they can be already in Bolok or later on, but the Shabbos before them is Chukas. But anyways, there's an association that it comes in the proximity of the Parshas Chukas, and the Shalosh says that the holidays, which would include also the Rabbanan, also this, uh, have a connection to the events that take place, the events of the year. Unleuten bewussten Wort von Shalom. According to the known expression of the Shalom, that all festivals of the year, koilel oich me'edim Rabbanan, not only festivals of the Torah festival, but that the Shalosh statement applies to also festivals of the Rabbanon, of the rabbis. Seine Nirmas in the Parshas HaTorah are hinted in the portions of the Torah, welche man leint in the Shabbos, ze seinen Chal, those that we read in the Shabbos that those events take place, the holidays that Rabbanon have a connection to the parsha. Is verstandig. So therefore, it's understood as es is do a remes in Parshas Chukas of the Geula from Gimel Tammuz that there is a hint in the portion of Chukas for the redemption of Gimel Tammuz. So the Rebbe will explain later on how Parshas Chukas, uh, the name of Chukas, but also um, the Rebbe connects this actually to um, is a level of Kiddush Hashem, and and the Rebbe brings down this the Kiddush Hashem with Moshe Rabbeinu by the Mei Meriva, which that would be the reason why the connection, why the Rebbe would not uh, agree to leave, even though it was Pikuach Nefesh and he had all the rights to, but because that was a Kiddush Hashem, as the Rebbe will explain. Base. First, the Rebbe wants to say that even though Gimel Tammuz was the beginning, uh, and the actual redemption is in Yud Beis Tammuz, because that's when he was totally free. Just like when the blessing of Hagoimel, that you thank Hashem when you get healthy, you don't do it in the middle, you do it when you're completely healthy. So with regards to the celebration, with regard to health, we do it at the end when it's complete. But as far as when the actual occurrence, the move from prison to out of prison is a much greater than moving from exile to freedom. But in the beginning, it's also already has the end in it. So therefore, the Rebbe says there's a big celebration. Gimel Tammuz is also, even though the actual celebration is later on, as the Rebbe explains now. Base. In der Geula von Rebben seine gewähnt zwei Klolos dicke Schloben. In the redemption of the Rebbe, there were two generally steps. Gimel Tammuz is befreit geworden from Beis Hasurim. On the third day of Tammuz, he was freed from the prison. Aber man hat ihm dann verschickt in Golus of 3 Jahr, but he was sent away in exile for 3 years. So that was the first step. He was freed from prison, and then he was sent for 3 years in exile. Erst noch b'Yud Beis Yud Gimel Tammuz. It is only on the 12th and the 13th of Tammuz he was freed on the 12th. He had to wait another day because there was some holiday over there. So the Goyisha, so the papers he got on the 13th of Tammuz is in ganzen befreit geworden. That's when he was entirely freed, completely freed. So that's the second step. Then he became free, that he's no longer exiled. When the he was allowed to return home. So these are two steps. So kumtuis. So it turns out, because these are two steps, as Begimul Tammuz is given the Haschola Sagula, that the beginning of the redemption started with Gimul Tammuz. On Yud Beis, Yud Gimel Tammuz is given the Shlemus HaGeula, and the 12th, the 13th of Tammuz, that's the complete redemption. Gimel Tammuz is the beginning, the opening, and then there was the complete on Yud Beis, Yud Gimel Tammuz. And because it's the beginning, Umahai Taima is Faranan Ilu in Gimel Tammuz, Lagabe Yud Beis, Yud Gimel Tammuz. There is an advantage, there is something special about Gimel Tammuz, even relative to Yud Beis Yud Gimel Tammuz. Af al pi as der Chag Geula is nikva geworden if Yud Beis Yud Gimel Tammuz davke. Although the festival, the celebration of the redemption has been set not for Gimel Tammuz but for Yud Beis Yud Gimel, the 12th and 13th of Tammuz davke. That doesn't mean that there is not an advantage to the Gimel Tammuz. Celebration needs to be set. A festival is made when it's complete. Is those while the inyan von Achag. The reason why it was set up for Yud Beis Yud Gimel Tammuz is because the idea of a festival, v'simcha, and a matter of joy, Geluya, an open joy, is men kavev, and the geula is bishlemus. You set it up when the redemption is fully complete. Al derech v'birchas hagoymel, similar to the blessing of Thanksgiving, the bracha of the Gemel, which a person makes, was the Rebbe had gemacht erst noch der Geula b'yud bis Tamuz. The Rebbe made that after the redemption of the 12th of Tammuz. Weil man kann nicht machen die Brache, because you cannot make this Brache until you totally leave the danger. Ad quoting until you completely become healthy when a person is not well from the brachas hanenin of the Alter Rebbe. You wait till complete. So to make a festival, to make a goimel, to celebrate, you have to wait to the end. But in the idea of redemption, the beginning has an advantage. But in etzem inyan hagula, but as far as the essence of the idea of redemption is da'an ilu in hascholos hagula, there is an advantage in the beginning of the redemption. Legabe shlemus hagula, relative to the complete redemption, there is a advantage in the beginning. So, what would be the advantage? So, there's a couple of things. Because in addition, first of all, to open up, to break through is always harder. We know kol haschol is kosher. So while noisaf lazeh, on top of it, in the addition, was in the haschol is not the maila, that in the beginning you have the advantage, was man brecht durch die Schwierigkeit from kol haschol is kosher, is that you have broken through, you break through the difficulties. From all the beginnings are difficult. To begin something is very difficult. So when you begin, you break through that. So that's something which is at the beginning. So the beginning has a. So in addition to that, Hayois as by der Ascholas Hageula tut sich auf der Shinui ba'ad lahofchei, because the beginning of the redemption that brought about a change to the extreme opposite. Hamatzah from Golus, Goyla to Gula. That turns around Golus, which is Goyla with the Aleph, to Gula with an Aleph, which means it's a total turnaround. The out of prison to freedom is a total turnaround. That's a change from Golus to Gula. And whereas the other change is not as extreme, and the Rebbe says, but especially considering in this case, especially in our case, the case with the Alter Rebbe, with the Friediger Rebbe, was der Shinui Hamatzav bepashtus was hat sich aufgetan, the change, the condition that literally that has been accomplished durch the Geula begimel Tamuz, through the redemption of the third of Tamuz. The Bafraying from Beis Hasurim, the Friediger Rebbe was freed in Gimel Tammuz from incarceration, from imprisonment. Ubefrat, it wasn't just regular incarceration, it was frat in the Umständen von der Medina Ahiba Yom Mahem, especially the circumstances of that country. In those days, that was an incarceration much more difficult than it would be in another country in other times. But this was a real serious situation. On Übergehen, and the fact that you can transform afilu in a matzah from Golus, even though you're still exiled in an in a far land, even in a full free, but you got out from this prison, is given become a protim. So then, in many details, Gresser, that's a greater change. That change, vider shinui v'chiluk from Zayin begoyle, then the change that takes place and the difference from being in exile, and going free to your home. Getting out of prison to freedom is a much greater change and an opposite change from exile, from non-freedom to incarceration to freedom is much greater than getting freed from exile to being free. Especially the Rebbe adds that over there it's not really freedom. full freedom. Befrat as euch seindig noch dem Bebeise over there, even after the priest Rebbe went home, he still is a given unter Ashgoch from Memshala. He was still under supervision. They were looking after him, and they were so even though he went away from exile, and then, but he was still under their radar, under their eyes. They were watching him. So this is a beginning which is hard, and the change was made. Uh, uh, the beginning was hard, and the change was a major change. But in addition to all this, the Rebbe says the beginning includes the entire thing, just like by a Rashi Tevis, when we have the first letter of a word, that letter, even though it's one word, the beginning, but it includes the whole world. So in the opening includes the entire Geulah. Is doch Yedua. It's known as in the Raschola from Yedin Inyan that in the beginning of every matter is kolul the ganze Zach. The whole thing is included. So in Gimel Tammuz, it's already included the entire Gula. Aderech we make it in the minion for Rosh Tevis, similar that we find in the idea of the first letter of a word. An inyan apitoida is eich or neich betoida. That's according to the Torah. There is Rosh Tevis, and also in the Torah we find references the Gemara, which the first letter means the whole letter, means the whole word. As der erster Eis von a Wort, that the first letter from a word is merames of dem ganzen Wort. That hints for the entire word, which means includes in itself the entire word. Ukedoime, and similar to this. So similar in our case, as the ganze Geula from the Rebbe is given nirmas and kolul, that the entire redemption of the Rebbe is hinted and included in the Rascholos HaGeula from Gimel Tammuz, in the beginning of the redemption of Gimel Tammuz. So therefore, the Rebbe says that this, if we talk, there's two steps, but the whole idea of redemption is included in this Gimel Tammuz. That Rebbe will explain, gives out what the Rebbe experienced and what the redemption meant for the Friedrich Rebbe, and that's how it's connected to the Parshas Chukas. So the Rebbe is going to explain that everything that the Friedrich Rebbe worked for was his Siddur Nefesh, but it wasn't just self-sacrifice, but it was a non-calculated and a non-limited Mesirus Nefesh. Gimel. Der Teuchen Kloli from the Meiser Ugeula from the Rebbe. The general idea, the content, what is the incarceration and the redemption of the Rebbe, is doch verbunden mit seiner Avoide, that is tied to his work von Arbotzes HaTorah, spreading Torah, v'achzokas hayadus, strengthening Yiddishkeit, v'hafatzosom, and to disseminate it in Medina, in that country where he lived. Was the Avoide b'yomim hahem, this service during those days, had gefordert Mesiras Nefesh b'poil. That required, actually, literally, self-sacrifice. In order to work this work, you put your life on the line, and you basically gave up your life in order to do this work. And even more, Vigeret come upon him, as mentioned many times, is those given nitztam amisidas nefesh. This wasn't just self-sacrifice, not amisidas nefesh, b'li hagbolos ucheshbonis. It was a self-sacrifice without any limitations, without any considerations. No cheshbonis. If you would get involved, get into a calculation, Sie es seinen do eus sichten al pitaba zum Atzleach sein. Are there chances naturally to succeed? If you started to calculate in the Avodah doing this work, and similar, Wollt nicht gewinnt kein Ort zu umgehen mit der Arbeit. Then there would be no room. It didn't make any sense to continue this work. If you try to figure out does it make sense? Balachas kam v'kama, and for sure nicht zu meiser nefesh sein sich auf them, and certainly not to self-sacrifice for it. And that even for himself, that didn't make sense to self-sacrifice. There was no chance of success uh, rationally. So, and not only did he sacrifice himself, but he sent other people, his shluchim, who also self-sacrificed. They gave up literally themselves. For sure, it didn't make any sense if you did it calculated Mesiras Nefesh, nicht zu einstellen the Lebens von Talmido v'shluchim, not to put the lives of his students uh, and his message, his shluchim, is those who followed and listened to him and went out to put their lives on the line to leave their avodah for this avodah. Logically, this didn't make any sense. So the Rebbe has said, but he spoke many times that the Rebbe's Mesiras Nefesh wasn't calculated. Und dem Eufen von Mesiras Nefesh, on keine cheshbonis. This type of self-sacrifice without any calculation, hat man gesehen, begolui beim Rebben. You saw this openly by the Rebbe in sein Ober der Monter an Hoge Bechlal, in his above-mentioned conduct in general. You saw that in general, that was the Friedrich Rebbe's conduct. He was Mesiras Nefesh, but especially as it relates to Gimel Tamuz, befrat begesher zu sein Geula begimel Tamuz, especially to his, in connection to his redemption in Gimel Tamuz. Biz as der etzem Teidig von Gimel Tamuz, to the extent this is so intertwined with Gimel Tamuz. When we talk about the date of Gimel Tamuz, b'shayches to the Geula, as it relates to the redemption, der Mont of sein Mesiras Nefesh. This reminds us of Mesiras Nefesh, because what happened at Gimel Tamuz, with the previous Rebbe not wanting to go for Shabbos and putting his life on the line, this reminds us of the Rebbe's level of Mesiras Nefesh of the Friedrich Rebbe. Come on, as the Rebbe will explain. B'yesh loymar, and the Rebbe says that the reason why this fullest level of Mesiras Nefesh can be associated to what happened in Gimel Tammuz and the Rebbe's attitude is because Gimel Tammuz is the beginning of the redemption of the whole Yud Beis Yud Gimel Tammuz as well. V'yesh loymar, ados was die Geula von Gimel Tammuz is given verbunden mit der Darge von Mesiras Nefesh. The fact that the redemption of Gimel Tammuz is tied with this level, the level of Mesiras Nefesh, without any calculation, on kein hagbolos von cheshbon, without any limitations of calculation, is while in der Haschola von der Geula, because in the beginning of this redemption, has gedarft ausdrücken der Teuchen Kloli von der Meiser Geula. It needed to express the general theme of the incarceration and redemption. And that's why Gimel Tammuz was the time. That's the redemption. That's the idea. And then you had the expression over here with the Rebbe's full Mesiras Nefesh beyond any reason or rationale. What happened at Gimel Tammuz? The Rebbe is going to go through the story about he was offered to leave prison and he refused because he would not ride on Shabbos. Dalet. The Rebbe Bal Hagula Vasimcha Derzelt, the Rebbe, the master of redemption and joy, related. As Doneshtik Rosh Chodesh, which means this was during the celebration for the redemption of the Friedrich Rebbe. So he related as Doneshtik Rosh Chodesh Tamuz Far Mitog. that on Thursday, which was Rosh Chodesh Tammuz, uh, before the morning, it was the 30th day of Sivan. It was the Rosh Chodesh, it was Aleph the Rosh Chodesh Tammuz. Before the afternoon, hat man ihm angesagt die Yediyah, they had notified him, they gave him the notice, as me lost him arois from Beis HaAsurim, that they are allowing him out of prison. Me verschickt him auf 3 Jahr Golus, and that he's being sent away, exiled for 3 years, in der Stadt Kastrama, to the city of Kastrama. Dabei hat man ihm gelost wissen, and at that time they let him know, they notified him, as batog vet men im befreien for Tvisa, that by day they're going to free him from the imprisonment. Mir hat ihm der Leib zu verbringen 6 Show mit seine Bnei Bais. They allowed him to spend 6 hours with the family members. Und ihm angesagt, and they instructed him, as by Nacht, that's Thursday night, wird müssen verlassen die Stadt. He will have to leave the city fahren kein Kastrama, and he'll have to travel to Kastrama. Also wie das ist gewesen Donnerstag, since this was Thursday, hat der Rebbe gefragt, when wird ankommen in Kastrama? He asked, when will he arrive in Kastrama? Hat man ihm geantwortet, so they answered, as wird dahin ankommen Shabbos, that he will arrive there on Shabbos. Hat der Rebbe gesagt, so the Rebbe said, as Shabbos wird beshum öfen nicht fahren. On Shabbos, under no circumstances, he won't travel. Und erst noch a spezieller Histadlus in the Kreisen von der Memshala, in the circles of the government, a special effort, hat man gepoilt, they were able to influence that the Rebbe soll kennen fahren, that the Rebbe should be able to travel Zuntik, on Sunday, which was Gimel Tammuz, which was the 3rd of Tammuz. So he stayed Thursday, Friday, and Shabbos until Sunday. He can travel on Sunday. Und bis damals ist geblieben in Turma. Until then, he remained in prison. So, and the Rebbe says it wasn't like everybody agreed for the Rebbe to be freed. There were people, the local people, the lower people, they wanted the Rebbe to stay in prison. It's the order came from above. So the Rebbe was in danger. He had to deal with these people. They could, if they could, they would change all the time. Einer von die, was haben bepoilt durchgeführt, der Arrest von der Rebbe, hat gesagt dem Rebbe. The one of them who actually arrested the Rebbe, he actually took the Rebbe into prison, he told the Rebbe, also Eber wird nicht maskim sein zu fahren Donnerstag, if he's not going to agree to go on Thursday by Nacht, und ankommen Shabbos in Kastrama, and to come to Shabbos in Kastrama, wird ihm nicht herauslassen von Turma, he's not going to allow him to go out of jail. Hat der Rebbe geantwortet, so der Rebbe answered, as ist great zu bleiben in Turma, wie viel soll nicht sein. He's ready to stay in prison for as long as it should be. Aber Shabbos wird bestimmt einfach nicht fahren, but he's not going to travel on Shabbos. So, now the Rebbe is going to ask, but okay, he refused to go because he's going to come on Shabbos. The logically, in a calculated way, he could have not traveled on Shabbos. A lot of things could have happened. Getting out of jail is something which is a certainty. Get yourself out of jail, and then weiter. Further, we'll work out the details. But no. So what? Why did the Rebbe insist that? It put himself seemingly in further danger. Hey, Azah noge zu stellen sich mit Azah Teukif. Such a conduct to put this to stand with such a force. Nicht zu fahren Shabbos, not to travel on Shabbat for the Tasbora. This requires explanations. Seems not reasonable. Durch sein Absorgen sich auszufolgen dem Befehl, zu fahren gleich in Kastrama, by refusing the order to immediately travel to Kastrama, when die schon gewinn muchen ihm zu befreien von Turma, at the time they were ready to free him, and he defies the order, bleiben in Turma, and he remains in prison, Hat der Rebbe sich hereingestellt gleich, this immediately in a Matze von Vadei Sakon. He put himself in a certain danger by refusing this order. Milachatchila is doch auf ihm gewähnt a Gzar Din von Efach HaChaim Rachman l'Islam. To begin with, there was a decree which is opposite of life, God forbid. He had a death sentence. The Rebbe doesn't want to say death. He says Efach HaChaim. The opposite of life, Rachman l'Islam. That was the sentence. Nur durch Ishtadlus, but it was through efforts, hat man die Geseide mevatel gewähnt. So this decree has been negated. Und es ist verbieten auf dem leichteren Einisch, and they exchanges for the lighter punishment for 10 years, first 10 years, and then later 3 years in Golus. The lighter punishment of 10 and then eventually 3 years in exile. Und euch noch dem, and it doesn't mean that everybody agreed to that. Haben die welche haben Milachatchila gegeben dem Gzar Din. So, even after this, those who initially gave out the decree, Harishna now, they didn't change their opinion. Gezwungen von der Hechere Memscholle Kreisen, they forced them from the higher ups in the government circles, they forced them as bleibendig betafkidum v'tokvom. They didn't fire them. They said, you remain in your position, in your full force, but yet you're forced to free the Rebbe. Sollen sie, so they should have been mevatel sein dem prat. So they need to negate this detail, urtel, this punishment, this verdict, befreien dem Rebbe von Turme, and free the Rebbe from incarceration, from the jail. So, but those people there were basically forced. They incarcerated the Rebbe, and they were forced to allow, and the Rebbe is refusing the order. He's not moving. As ba'ofen zeh, in such a situation where they don't really want him to go free, is ein bleiben b'rshusam in Turma, to remain under their control in prison. Given sekonis nefashis mamish, this was actually literally dangerous. Ubefrat, especially as those gufas was the Rebbe hat sich abgesagt zu formen Shabbos. The fact that he refused to go on Shabbos, this is a rebellious act from the Rebbe. They're giving you an order, you're not going. And this has brought out by them a great anger, a big and great additional anger on the Rebbe. He rebelled their decree, their order. They ordered him to leave, and he says no. And Mefarsim given in Zeir Turma, in their prison, he publicized Shmira Shabbos, that keeping Shabbos, and in the greatest public way, Hapkidim v'Hasurim, by the people working there and the people incarcerated. Nit kennen durchführen Zeir Bezima, they could not accomplish their plot. Zu goyim sein, they were as the Rebbe's or for Shabbos. They plotted for the Rebbe to go on Shabbos. That's why they wanted to release him on Thursday. But the Rebbe refusing that is disobeying their command, disobeying their instructions, and that got them even more angry because they plotted to leave him on Thursday so the Rebbe would drive on Shabbos. So this endangered himself to go stay with these people in prison. Further endangers himself. Li'idach. And on the other hand, so let's take this. So what's the concern? Shabbos, Vibald wasn't necessarily that he was going to have to travel on Shabbos. Vibald yitziyah mibeis hasurim. Since going out of prison needed to take place Thursday by day, is doch der Inyan von Chilul Shabbos given. So then, this idea of desecrating Shabbos was nit ba'oises man klau. First of all, it wasn't at that time. It wasn't really. Shabbos was going to be desecrated when he's going to travel. he might end up on Shabbos on the third day on when he reaches there. But at this point, he's not violating the Shabbos right now. And number two, blows together suffix. It's only a doubt, maybe not become a sfekis. There's many doubts. It doesn't necessarily mean that if you being going out now on Thursday doesn't mean that he's going to end up for sure traveling on Shabbos in Kastelma. Why? Warum es ist doch noch der Befreiung b'yom Chamishi given? Because after the freeing on Thursday, noch aggressor meglechai, there was even greater possibilities for hishtadlus of effort. Uba Hanagosei from the Rebbe, and it would be led by the Rebbe because the Rebbe would be free at that point from the prison, as soll nicht darfen reisfahren gleich bei Nacht, that he should not need to go immediately that night. So he could maybe delay it, and then he would not be traveling on Shabbos. Und viele wollte es nicht gekannt beweisen in der kurzer Zeit. Even if they would not be able to accomplish this in the short time left, is geblieben a ganze Meisles von Nisia bis Shabbos. So there was still an entire 24 till Shabbos comes around, that there was time that he could have gone and he can stop on the way. During that time, there was the possibility for a great effort. Soll sich abstellen in der Mittenweg bis nach Shabbos, that he should stop in the middle of the way till after Shabbos. So there was other possibilities to have the Rebbe let him go out of prison. He would be out of prison. And then work out perhaps to not have to travel on Shabbos. Unafila, and let us say in the worst case, Unafila eberwold given gezwungen bleiben in Bandwagon b'yom Shabbos. Even if he would have been forced to remain in the train wagon during Shabbos, is it noch an onus that it's against his will? It's an onus, is exempt. Blois in an isur drabonon, and this would also only be a rabbinic isur techumim, that he's traveling beyond the limitation which is with the Rabbanon on Shabbos. Der gefinnen sich in a vorndigen Bahn is nicht an Asis Malacha. The fact that you find yourself in a train that is moving, that's not doing work. It's the only thing is that you're moving the Tchum with Rabbanon. So, weigh the immediate danger, certain, and weigh the possible coming on Shabbos there. Is doch l'chayre t'mu b'yosef surprising. Pavos hat sich der Rebbe gestellt mit a Teukef. Why did the Rebbe put himself with such a force, gegen dem Vorn, to oppose the travel? Und sich hereingestellt Teukef in a Matze für Sakona. He put himself immediately in a situation of danger. L'chayre would seem, hat the erste Sach gedarf gleich herausgehen von der Sakona. Beis Asurim. Similarly, he should have first immediately get out of the danger from the incarceration, from the prison. Und danach suchen Eitzes, wie only darfen for Shabbos, and then looking for ways, for ideas not to have to travel on Shabbos. So the Gimel Tamuz Mesiras Nefesh demonstrates to us a very deep level of self-sacrifice by the Rebbe. This is a demonstration how the Rebbe worked, that his Mesiras Nefesh was in a way not calculated over here for keeping Shabbos. Vov, azam Mesiras Nefesh anhoga. Such a conduct for Mesiras Nefesh hat man gesehen beim Rebbe, you saw by the Rebbe in dem ganzen Zugang zu der Avodah von Abotzes HaTorah. His total approach, his approach from the work of spreading Torah, v'chizuk hayadus b'medina ha'i, and strengthening Yiddishkeit in that country. Bigeret come upon him, has spoken many times. How the Rebbe's Mesiras Nefesh herumgenommen. The Rebbe's self-sacrifice, it encompassed nicht bloß in Yonim, mit welchem is mechuyev sich Mesiras Nefesh sein. it didn't include only those matters which a person is halachically obligated to self-sacrifice. But also in such aspects which are defined, he has the option if he wants to be a Mesiris Nefesh or not. The Rebbe gave up a life even in optional matters. Furthermore, even things which others would say that you shouldn't. His self-sacrifice was also on such matters. Was many of the great and the sages of Islam gehalten, they were of the opinion that you should not give up your life for these matters. So, in many matters that the Rebbe's work involved were areas that was not obligated to have self-sacrifice, to the extent that some said that he should not sacrifice in those cases. Is wenn es redt sich wegen Klolus ha-Avoida von Rebben, der Medina hi, kann man noch verstehen, seinen Hoge. So the Rebbe says, okay, so but this goes even further. So when you talk about the work of the Rebbe in that country, we can understand why he conduct himself in such a way. We can explain it, even though you're not obligated, because the condition of the situation at that time was such that it was threatening all of Yiddishkeit. So even though those details weren't so important, we can understand why he conducted in such a way. As der Matze von Eden bei Medina is azah, when he saw the condition of the Eden in that country is such, as der Etzem Kiem von Eden und Yiddishkeit is gestanden in größer Konne, that just the existence of Yidden and Yiddishkeit was in danger. That the lamp of the Jews should not be extinguished, God forbid. Wissendig sein Schliches, and knowing that his mission as Nasi Yisrael, as the Prince of Israel, the leader of Israel, was Darf Zorgun Farinkim von Am Yisrael, that he needs to worry about the existential existence of the Jewish people. So when the Rebbe had self-sacrifice for Yidden, he did not consider any calculations, no limitation. But in our case, this is understood in other cases, but in our case, we're not even talking about saving Yiddishkeit. This is a personal matter, seemingly. This is not a matter which touches at least the benefit of many in the community. It's not even connected to community. This is a question how he conducts himself in a personal way. It's his personal life. Shall he journey? Shall he travel to Kassim or not? Why did the Rebbe also in this case put himself in such a Mesiris Nefesh? On the contrary, durch der Anhoge stellt ein in Sakone the ganze Avede Shaloi Barabotzes HaTorah v'Chizuk HaYadus. Through this conduct, he puts his entire service spreading Yid Torah and strengthening Yiddishkeit in danger. So why did he do that? Zayin. V'yashleimer da hasbara bazeh. We can say the explanation. The Rebbe explains it was an issue of Chilul Hashem, because they wanted him to travel on Shabbos, and giving into that would cause a profaning the name of Hashem. And this is connected to the parsha, which Moshe Rabbeinu was punished not to go to Eretz Yisrael because he didn't be Mekadesh Hashem. And the Rebbe explained, the Shleimer da Hasbara Bazeh. The Kudas Inyan Zeh, What is the point of this idea? Hat sich da nicht gehandelt, because really the point here is not the question. The issue here was not whether you should or not self-sacrifice because of Shabbos. No, da ist gestanden die Scheile von Kiddush Hashem und Chillul Hashem. The question was sanctifying Hashem's name or desecrating Hashem's name. The Matore, the goal from Divos of Maristir the Rebbe, those who incarcerated the Rebbe, is given kidei zu stellen the arbeit that was in order to disrupt the work from the Rebbe Machzokas HaYadus of strengthening Yiddishkeit. Ilu Yitzuyer as the Rebbe will nicht gleich gegengestellt. Let's just imagine if the Rebbe would not immediately oppose the Pekuda, this order, zuvor bald noch sein Befreiung, to travel immediately after freeing Kirtzonim as they wanted to. As the Rebbe is on foreign Shabbos, that the Rebbe should travel on Shabbos. That would be for them a victory. The Rebbe maskim given zu foreign Shabbos. The Rebbe agreed to go on Shabbos. The alle Herrer from the Raskome, those who heard the Rebbe's agreement, they would not know all the considerations, the calculations that we said before, that he might not really have to violate the Shabbos. As men sich beshtadel bechashoyi, that in a quiet way they put an effort here. Men sicher zu poil sein, and that you're sure that you're going to impact. The Rebbe's only dafen for on Shabbos. He's not going to have to travel on Shabbos. They don't know that. The people don't know. They saw the Rebbe agreed to travel on Shabbos. They won. As we spoke many times, as b'shas es retzich wegen Kiddush Hashem und Chillul Hashem. When we're talking about the sanctification of God's name or desecration of God's name, is nit negeit si de Zach wegen welches retzich is verbunden mit einer Isur Achichomer, is not connected. We don't care if it's talking about a very serious prohibition or that an Isur Achikal or the very light Isur. If it's a matter of desecrating God's name, it doesn't matter what kind of a prohibition we're talking here. The only consideration is to mention a room, whether the people around whether the people around may translate this to being something opposite, and therefore that's the only consideration. And the Rebbe says, this is also the connection from Gimel Tamuz to the portion of Chukas, as the Rebbe said that we read. In Parshas Chukas wird erzählt wegen der Mechet von Mei Meriva. Over there we read about the sin of the rebellious water, where the Yidden rebelled when they asked for the water, was to leave them, and because Moshe Rabbeinu and Aaron, they hit the rock instead of talking to it. So because of this, Moshe Aaron nenish geworden. So they were punished as loitoviyu as hakol azel oretz gomer, that you shall not bring this community to the land. Is the chayre nit verstandig? So it's seemingly not understood. Mitvos is der chet given azoy harb. What was the sin so serious? As to leave them, so Moshe nit arangehen in Eretz Yisrael, that Moshe should not be able to enter Eretz Yisrael. Ubifrat, as the Torah that sailed, especially Moshe Rabbeinu had other things. He questions Hashem. Hashem said, I will provide the meat, provide for this people. He questioned. And the Torah itself, the Torah tells us other matters by Moshe. Was Moshe is zu lieb sein, nenish geworden. Oh, another thing is that Moshe Rabbeinu was punished for that. Und von deswegen, he talked to Yidden, lo yaminuli, but they got tzaras because of that in other cases. Von deswegen is nenish geworden mit der Zahar b'neinish. He wasn't punished with such a serious punishment. So why is this punishment so strong? Dafke derchet, specifically this sin, der shinu zu schlagen dem Seller anstatt redensim. The fact that he beat the stone instead of talking to it, hat gebracht die Gzeira Chamura as soll nicht rein in Eretz Yisrael. This brought this very serious decree not to enter Eretz Yisrael. So why is this? And the reason is because Kiddush Hashem. Not the tam der Revert angedeitet in Pasuk. The reason for the serious sin over here is pointed to in the verse. Yan lo hamantim bi lagdisheni le'ene b'nei Yisrael. Because you didn't believe me to sanctify me in the eyes of the Yidden. Rashi zos mevayer, as Rashi explains, as their far is their chet merchoma. That's why this sin is more serious with the time of Moshe Rabbeinu zum Eibishter. Moshe Rabbeinu actually complained to the Eibishter something which seems a more grave. The gravity of the other sin's greater. He said to Hashem, "Hatzoinu boker yishachad lahem." He questioned, if you shecht all the cattle and soin, would that suffice them? And Rashi explained, "Valdort lefisha baseisa," because it was done quietly. It was between Moshe and the Eibishter. Chosach olav hakosa, the pasuk covered for him. But the Khan, Shebemaimed Kol Yisrael, but here it was in the standing of all Yidden. Lechosach olav hakosa, the pasuk did not cover for him. B'nei Kiddush Hashem, because the sanctification of Hashem, the missed opportunity of being able to be Mekadosh Hashem. Das heißt, this means, as wenn es retzich wegen Inyan von Kiddush Hashem oder Hovchai, when we're discussing about a matter of sanctifying Hashem's name, or the opposite, is negeya blois. Only thing what's important be azoy das wird ausgeteilt durch andere. How other people interpret it, what they look at it. Doesn't matter what the seriousness of it is. It really is serious. This would have been, by the Rebbe, this would have been declared that the Rebbe is traveling on Shabbos. He agreed to that, and that would have been a Chilul Hashem. The Rebbe wouldn't give them that victory, and that's why he had to oppose them immediately. And the Rebbe now is going to bring out even a deeper idea, the idea of chukah, the idea of engraved, how the Rebbe with his Mesiras Nefesh was really one of him, so they couldn't separate that. And that's why the Rebbe's insistence on not considering them went even further than just for Torah mitzvahs, was just not considering them as all, as the Rebbe will continue to explain. Oistes. A different inyan yesh loimer in them. A more deeper idea, the Rebbe says we can say over here. Der Oifen han Hoge, han Al von the Rebbe, that style of conduct of the Rebbe, was hat sich gegengestellt die Pekude, that he stood up against the directive von die welche directions, von die welche, or the commands from die welche him arrestiert, from those who arrested him, is given nicht nur wenn es hat angeriert begilui, begolui azach von Yiddishkeit. It's not only when it touched openly, when you can see, it didn't only when it affected something of Yiddishkeit. Nor wie der Rebbe erzählt, as the Rebbe related, as hat bei sich gemacht a festen Beschluss, that he made a firm decision, as soll klar nicht nispol werden farzei, that he should at all not be affected by them. Nicht nur soll sich nicht rechnen mit sie in Sachen, not only should he not consider them in matters, was eine Negeya begolit Yira Shemaim, which are openly connected to Yira Shemaim. Und zu libder Hanoge, because of that type of conduct, hat man der Rebbe bestraft mit Yisuda Guf Rachman Litzlan. They punished the Rebbe, God forbid, with, may Hashem protect us with physical pains. Im geschlagen, they beat him, v'chulu. In Azah Hanoge, so what's the idea here? In Azah Hanoge is doch nicht shaykh die Cheshbenes Hanal von Kiddush Hashem. This kind of conduct doesn't apply, this consideration, Kiddush Hashem, oder as es wird only in the Arbeit von Abbot Satorchul, or that it might affect the work of spreading Yiddishkeit. This was just the Rebbe's personal attitude. It was is der Tam von dem Eufen Anhoge from the Rebbe. So what is the reason for that type of conduct of the Rebbe? Is euch der Biur in der Anhoge nirmas in Parshas Chukas. The explanation of that kind of a conduct is also hinted to in the portion of Chukas. Gleich in Shem HaSedra, immediately as soon as the name of the Parsha, Chukas. And the Rebbe brings from the Alter Rebbe that Chukah means Chakika. It means engraved. And the level of engravement is you can't separate. Yud. The Alter Rebbe is Mevair, as Chukah is Meloshen Chakika Einkritzen. Chukah comes from the language engraving. The Yisrin from Chakika Lagabi Kesiva, the advantage of engraving over writing, by Kesiva seinen die Oisius dazugegebene Sach zum Klav. When you write, the letters are an added matter to the parchment. Auf welchen sie seinen geschrieben, on which they are written, the ink, and then you have the parchment. That's an addition to the parchment. Durch der Kesiva wird Take die Oisius vereinzigt mit dem Klav. Through writing, it's Take that the letters become one with the parchment. Das ist aber beäufen, but it's in a way, wie zwei Sachen was werden vereinigt. It's similar to two matters that become one. Und darüber kann in dem sein Ashinui bis Bittel. That's where there can be a change. And it can totally negate it, take it away. Man can uptell, you can separate, upmaking, erase the oasis from the cloth, the letters from the parchment. They're not permanent. They don't have to be there because it's two things that are put together. As opposed to Masha'enkin by Chakika, as opposed to when you engrave. Seine die Oisius nicht kein Basunder Metzias von der Sach. The letters are not a separate entity from the item in welche sie seinen ausgekritzt, in which they are engraved. Nor sie seinen Minei Ubei, they are from the stone itself or whatever you engraved it in, that becomes part of it. Sie seinen a tail von dem Metzias, von dem Even Teuve. They are part of this stone, the good stone, the precious stone, in welchen sie seinen ausgekritzt, in which they're engraved. Und der Fahr, and therefore is unmöglich abzuteilen the Oisius von dem Even. It's impossible to separate the letters from the stone. That under the Oisius, to touch the letters, if you touch the letters, is under the Even Toiv, then you're touching the stone. You can't touch just the writing without touching the stone. They are part of the stone. The selbe Sache is Beruchnis. Similar, same thing is in the spiritual level. When Avodas Hashem is blois via zugegebene Sach zu der Metzias Adam, when service of Hashem is only as an added aspect to the entity of the person, so there is the person and then you have service of Hashem, is meglech as in dem zon zayin shinuim, then it's possible that there should be changes there. Es kann sein am Matzev, it might be a situation, am soll nicht mekayim sein an inyan von Avodas Hashem, that maybe you're not going to fulfill an aspect of service of Hashem. For whatever reason, you may not always do the Avodas Hashem. Including also when it's your force, it's against your will. But your essence, your existence is not touched by it. Okay, you're not doing the service for whatever reason, but it doesn't touch you. Your entity remains. But when the service of Hashem becomes engraved in your existence, Avodas Hashem wird a Teil von ihm allein. The service of Hashem becomes a part of you. Demut is nichayich zu voneinander teilen ihm von Avodas Hashem. Then you cannot separate the person from service of Hashem. Zunehmen von ihm an Inyan von Avodas Hashem if you take away something from Hashem's service, main zunemen zuster sein mitzias. That means to take away. You're not taking away something extra that can be separated. That means destroying his existence. Al derech eine was will zerstören, die Zurus Ha'osis von Eben Teuf. It's similar to if you want to disturb, you want to break the shape of the letters of the precious stone, Dar Zayin Shviras Eben Teuf, then you have to break the precious stone. Und der Far, and therefore, by Aiden was Avodas Hashem is by Mchofiv and Afshe, a Yid whose service of Hashem is engraved in his soul, is sich meiser nefesh of kol prat uprat von Yiddishkeit. He gives up his life for every detail and detail of Yiddishkeit. On cheshbonos, without any calculation. Weil sie is unmöglich voneinander teilen, because it's impossible to separate zwischen ihm, between the person welchen inyan es soll sein von Avodas Hashem, and no matter what other aspect of the service of Hashem. They're one. And that means that everything remains together. You cannot have him not do Avodas Hashem and still stay in existence. That is his entire existence. Yudav, derech ze is given an Hoge from the Rebbe. Similar was the conduct of the Rebbe. Bibald inyonim as inyonim von Torah mitzvahs. Since the matters of Torah mitzvahs and Abayim given, boyfriend shechakika, they were in a way of engraved. Is the Riber Zamisidus Nefesh nit given verbunden, therefore his self-sacrifice wasn't tied, but keine cheshbonos, there was no consideration. Zi in dem Fall hahaloche as medarv sich moiser nefesh sein, whether in this case the law remains as you need to sacrifice, or that says maybe it doesn't pay chul, then this wasn't consideration because you can't separate. By ihm ist das nicht given an Inyan von Mesidas Nefesh zu lieb an andere Sach, shechutz v'menu. By him it wasn't self-sacrifice for something else, which is outside. By welches yeshayches acheshben, then you have a consideration, you make a calculation, see mizol sich meiser nefesh sein, whether you should sacrifice yourself. Now das ist gekommen ki ilu, but this came, so to speak, as if vi bederech memel automatically. Vibald avodas Hashem is given atil from sein mitzias gufa. Since service was his mitzias, it was not about paying for something else. That was his entity. Bis as es is unmöglich zu voneinander teilen zwischen sie, that it's impossible to separate between them. Is bederech memel, then it's automatically being given alle inyonim from avodas Hashem bis zu Mesiras Nefesh. Therefore, all of his matters in the service of Hashem were to the extent of Mesiras Nefesh. High timer, and for that reason is ein Mesiras Nefesh given nicht nur auf Sachen, was haben begolu angeriert sein Avodah. That's why his self-sacrifice weren't on those matters that openly touched his service. Nor hat sich Mesiras Nefesh given, but he gave up his life, not to subdue those who arrested him, not to subjugate himself in any matter for those people who arrested him. Sein nicht rechnen sich mit sie is nicht nur given an Inyan von Cheshbon. Not considering them wasn't something that I calculated. It wasn't a calculated conclusion. Nor had be'etzem nicht gekent nicht mehr werden be'ezo, but in essence he could not become subjugated, subdued in any way. For azelche v'shteren the arbet von abotzes haTorah, for those who interfere with the work of spreading Torah. Bibald as the avodah is by him in an oifon von chukas, since the avodah is engraved, chakika menei inside. So there's no way that he can subdue himself to those who came to interfere that. And that's why, that's the connection to Parshas Chukas. This is a deeper explanation. First of all, it was an inyan of Kiddush Hashem, but this doesn't explain why the Rebbe totally disregarded them, even in case, just not when it involved Torah mitzvahs, but the fact that the Rebbe was engraved. So therefore, there was no cheshbonos. It was automatically everything. It was part of him, of who he was, And those people who came to interfere with the Rebbe's work of Hashem, of Abotzes HaTorah, because he was engraved with that, he could not subdue himself, and he had to consider them as nothing, and that's why he had to have that attitude. This is Mesichas Shabbos, Parshas Chukas, Tovshin Mem Aleph, and Tovshin Mem Gimel.